Number 4 is actually really similar to number 1. In 1 year's time, 20% of Miss McElroy's investments increased by 5%. 30% of her investments decreased by 5%. And 50% of her investments increased by 3%. By what percent did the total of her investments increase? So we need to look at this in chunks. Here's what I know. 20% of Miss McElroy's investments increased by 5%. I also know that 30% of her investments decreased by 5%. And 50% of them increased by 3%. So we're breaking her investments up into 3 parts. The question we're answering is, by what percent did the total of her investments increase? So all of them put together. So I've kind of got to think of her investments in chunks. So I'm going to start out with this hole. This hole represents all her investments. So I'm answering a question about this hole. And I know some information about it, but not everything I need to know quite yet. 20% of her investments increased by 5%. So let's mark off about 20% of this. That 20%, that corresponds with what I have highlighted blue. Those investments increased by 5%. So now I kind of have to think of them as their own whole. They started at 100% of them, and they went to 105% of them. Just the blue stuff. We also know that 30% of her investments decreased by 5%. So 30% will bring us here. Those 30% of all her investments decreased by 5%. So they started at 100% of them, but they ended at 95% of what they began with. So overall, what we're describing here, this is going to be an overall loss, right? Because we're starting with a smaller amount that's increasing, but then this larger amount is decreasing. Luckily, the remaining 50%, or half of her investments, was 50% over here. Those investments increased by 3%. So they went from 100% of whatever they started at to 103% of whatever they started at. If I want to describe what's happening to all of her investments, I need to look at these 3 chunks added together. Let's look at the 20% first. It was 20% of our whole, so I'll represent it as 0.2. It increased by 5%. So by the end of it, it wasn't 0.2. It was 105% of 0.2, or in other words, 0.2 times 1.05. Let's look at the purple section next. The purple section describes a decrease of 5%. It was 30% of my whole. So it started as 30% of all my investments, but then the value of it went down to 95% of what I started with. Lastly, half my investments, that's 50%, they increased from 100% of what they started with to 103% of what they started with. So I'll take 0.5, that's half my investments, and I'm multiplying that by 1.03 because my investment has grown 3%. So let's compute each of these pairs of factors. My blue factors, 0.2 times 1.05. That gives us 0.21. So that represents my increase. I started at 20% of what I started with, and I ended up with 21% of my original, so that increased. My next pair is 0.3 times 0.95. So originally, that was 30% of what I invested overall. But now it's decreased in value, Now it's only 28.5% of what I invested overall. The last part of what I invested was half of my investment, and that increased by 3%. So it was 50% of what I originally invested. Now it's 51.5% of what I originally invested. When I add these three numbers together, I'm going to get what percentage of my original investment my account is now worth. So hopefully it's grown, right? You want your money to grow in general. So we're hoping that this number is bigger than 1 or 100%. So I'll take 0.21 plus 0.285 plus 0.515. And when I do this, I get 1.01. That means that my investment has grown by 1%. That 1 represents 100%, what I started with. So I've gone up by 1% overall. This sounds like a small amount, but if you had a lot of money invested, it might actually make a big difference. There were a lot of steps we took in solving this problem. When you solve problems like this, the most important part is to break it into chunks and look at what proportion each chunk represents of your whole.